Tomorrow, that's Tuesday at 11 a.m. UK time, we have a session on options for demand-side regulations. On Wednesday at 2 p.m. UK time, a session on forest sector transparency, and on Friday at 11 a.m. UK time, a session on new ideas for the forest sector. So nothing on Thursday this week. We are very much looking forward to rich discussions, and we hope these will feed into national debates as countries prepare for both the biodiversity and the climate COPs in 2021. So today we have a fantastic high-level panel for today's discussion. I will go through the panelists in turn. The detailed biographies should be available on Attendify, the app that you've all been sent a link to. So we're going to hear from the Right Honourable Lord Zach Goldsmith, who is Minister for the Environment for the United Kingdom. Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park was appointed as Minister of State in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He was appointed in 2020 in February. The Minister's responsibilities include climate change, environment and conservation, biodiversity, oceans and the Blue Belt. We'll then hear from Director General Dr. Cui Shuhong, who is the Director General of Ecology in the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in China, appointed in 2018. Before that, he was the Director General for Environmental Assessment. Then we'll hear from Minister Dr. Siti Nurbaya from Indonesia. Since 2014, she has been Minister for the Environment and Forestry, a big ministry housing more than 16,000 civil servants. The ministry serves as the focal point for climate change, biodiversity and other environmental issues. And previous to that, she was Secretary General of the Regional Representative Council of the Republic of Indonesia, the Indonesian Senate. She holds a PhD in environmental science. We then were going to hear from Dr. Rosalie Matondo, Minister of Forest Economy, Sustainable Development and Environment for the Republic of Congo. She was appointed in 2016 as the first woman to have held this post. Unfortunately, she is not very well today, and her presentation will be given by Head of Department, Pierre Tati. And then our final speaker this morning is Professor Zhong Jianping, who is Director General, Center for Regional Economic Cooperation, and also Director General for the Institute for Western Asia and Africa in the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, an affiliated institute to MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce. He is also the Vice President of China Research Association of Social and Economic Systems, and is a professor in economics at Peking University, amongst others. So the way we're going to run this session is that each panelist will have 5 minutes to make their introductory remarks. Following that, I will ask a few questions that we prepared for the panel, and then we will move into a broader discussion. During the broader discussion, we very much welcome your questions. Unfortunately, with Zoom, we can't allow individual questions from people holding the microphone, but the way to ask a question is to use the question and answer button, which is on the bottom of your screen, and type in your question. If there is a question in there that you think is a good question, feel free to like it, and then it gets upvoted. And behind the scenes, people will group questions together and pass the most popular ones on to me to ask the panel. Feel free to enter questions at any time because you're typing them out. You don't have to wait for me to say, has anybody got a question? And the sooner you ask them, the more chance there is for people to look at them and rank them through liking. Just before we start with Lord Goldsmith, a few items of housekeeping. This discussion is on the record. It is not under the Chatham House rule. It will be recorded and may be used in future, and it is also being live streamed. At the moment, we have about 150 people who are listening. There is simultaneous translation into English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and for today's session, into Chinese. If you want to listen to a language other than the one being spoken, the translate menu is also at the bottom of your screen, and go in there and select the language that you want. I've already noted that there is an app called Attendify, which allows people to communicate with each other and to see lots of online material, including the biographies of today's speakers. And finally, please feel free, because this is on the record, to tweet this session under the hashtag #CHForests. So without further ado, over to Lord Goldsmith. You've just been promoted there, Zach. Lord Goldsmith, who will have 5 minutes to talk about forest governance from his perspective.
Thank you very much, Tim. And it's an honor to be speaking to you today. I hope everyone listening and taking part is safe and well. Kojo Owusu Afri, known in Ghana as Sir John, very sadly died earlier actually I think at the end of last week, and he would have been joining us to reflect on our very long-standing partnership and on Ghana's approach to combating illegal logging and promoting trade and sustainable forest land use. And I send my condolences to his family, and I'm sure others on the call would join me in doing so. The COVID-19 crisis has had an unprecedented impact on the world already. It's exposed our vulnerabilities, and it is, I hope, a wake-up call to the consequences of our abusive relationship with the natural world. But terrible though this experience has been for so many people around the world, the brutal truth is that it will be dwarfed by the effects of climate change and environmental degradation unless we act very quickly and decisively. Politicians right now, everywhere, are designing their economic recovery packages. And so far, governments around the world have committed around $9 trillion to the COVID recovery. And how they choose to spend those funds is going to have ramifications for decades. And we have a choice. We can stick with the status quo, bailing out high carbon, environmentally damaging industries and locking in decades of emissions and environmental destruction, or we can choose to make environmental sustainability and resilience the lens through which we map out our recovery. And you won't be surprised to hear that I favour the latter course, and I'm delighted that the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, committed very publicly to, quote, build back better and build back greener. And as COP26 presidents, we'll be making the case at every opportunity for a clean and green recovery. And we're asking other countries to introduce greater ambition in their own nationally determined contributions. And our focus, of course, will be on clean energy, zero emissions, vehicles, finance, adaptation, resilience. But at its core, there will be a major emphasis on nature. And the reason simply is that you cannot tackle climate change without also tackling environmental destruction, and vice versa. For example, in addition to providing livelihoods for over 1 billion people and a home to some 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, deforestation is the second biggest source of emissions, which is destroying them at a rate of around 30 football pitches every minute. Now, we're told that nature-based solutions to climate change could provide around 1/3 of the cost-effective climate change mitigation that we need over the next decade, while also helping communities adapt to become more resilient and also helping reverse biodiversity loss. In truth, it's probably much higher than 30%. But despite this huge contribution nature can make in terms of tackling climate change, nature-based solutions attract around 3% of global climate funding, and that makes zero sense. At the end of last year, the British Prime Minister announced that we are doubling our international climate finance to £11.6 billion, which is approximately $14 billion. And even more importantly, we've said that we will be spending much of that new uplift on nature-based solutions. And as co-hosts of the next climate COP, we are going to be asking other countries to do the same. We need protection and restoration of nature to be a core priority globally. But we know it's not all about public money. We need international collaboration and we need structural change. And that means, among other things, looking at the incentives that exist, both public and market incentives. From the Amazon rainforest to the peat swamps of the Cuvette Centrale, we all rely on forests, yet their value currently barely registers. They're worth more dead than alive, and the financial incentives that destroy forests outstrip those in favor of their protection by around 40 to 1. In the UK, we're leading by example in switching our agricultural subsidies away from rewarding destruction towards a system of public money in return for public goods, goods like environmental stewardship. And if you consider that agriculture causes around 80% of the world's deforestation, and that the top 50 food-producing countries spend around $700 billion a year in support for often destructive land use, you only need to imagine the impact if global support of that sort shifted in favor of sustainability. That's more than 5 times the budget of all the world's aid agencies combined. So tackling those incentives is critically important. Now, we've seen some successes in recent years with illegal timber. Much of that has been the consequence of many years of cooperation and partnership between countries, coming together to tackle the illegal trade, promote the responsible and sustainable alternative, and to protect forests. Building on that work, we want to bring consumer and producer countries together at COP26 to address the market drivers of deforestation. And we know that in the UK that even while we're getting our own house in order, our environmental footprint extends vastly beyond our shores. The commodities we import alone come with devastating levels of deforestation. So we're determined to clean up our own supply chains and to work directly with other countries, both consumer and producer countries, to deliver change internationally. And I really commend China for taking steps towards excluding illegal forest products from its own gigantic supply chains. If we get it right, we can protect forests and livelihoods in consumer and producer countries around the world. And the government-to-government dialogue that we plan for COP26 will draw very heavily on that work that many of you at this forum have been involved in. Indeed, lessons drawn out at this meeting can help shape our preparations for action at COP26. I invite all countries to join this collaborative effort, and especially so many here today. We're committed to working closely with all of you, and with China as host of the all-important CBD COP. And I hope that what we learned today will enrich a government-to-government dialogue at COP26. As countries respond to COVID-19, the decisions we take in the coming months will have impacts for decades. We have all the tools we need for a green, resilient recovery. So it is time to get to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Goldsmith. Great timekeeping. So on that note, going from the hosts of the UN FCCC COP to the hosts of the CPD COP, I'd like to ask Director General Sui Shu-hong to give his remarks now, please. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hello. 尊敬的高登史密斯男爵，各位女士、先生、朋友好。
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Currently, it's evening time in Beijing. I know that in the UK, it is still morning time. My name is Sui Shu-hong. I am Director General of the Department of Nature and Ecology Conservation from the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. I'm also the Director of Office from the Chinese side in the preparation of COP15. Thank you, Lord Goldsmith, for your invitation. I would also like to congratulate on the opening of the 30th Global Forum on Forest Governance by Chatham House. This forum brings together governments, businesses, and civil societies. It gives a great platform to share experiences. I'm sure that we will be able to hear a lot of new ideas, new perspectives on global forest governance and sustainable development. As mentioned by previous speakers, when we talk about climate change, protection of biodiversity, and sustainable development, forest plays a vital role. Taking this opportunity, I want to touch upon what China has done in areas such as restoring forest ecosystems, addressing climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. Chinese government highly value ecosystem restoration through measures such as conserving natural forests, reforestation, afforestation, and the conversion of cropland into forest land, which contributed positively to the global forest restoration. According to SatNav data from 2000 to 2017, the Earth was greener than 20 years ago. This is outcome achieved by all countries working together. China contributed a quarter of the newly added green area globally, among which forests had a 42% contribution. In order to further strengthen ecological protection and restoration and ensure national ecological security, in May this year, China issued the National Master Plan on Major Ecosystem Protection and Restoration Programs, which pressed ahead the conservation and the restoration of ecosystem in forests, grasslands, deserts, rivers, lakes, wetlands, and oceans. It also set out major quantitative targets and policy measures by 2035. We know that biodiversity loss and climate change pose major challenges to the global environmental governance, and they too are interconnected through ecosystem. Nature-based solutions utilize mitigation and adaptation potentials of the ecosystem, as well as provide foundation to address climate change and biodiversity protection in a coordinated manner. At the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit, China and New Zealand jointly led some work in the NBS field. We released the Natural-Based Solutions Declaration, initiative case collections. At a later stage, also established a follow-up cooperation platform, the NBS Friends Group. NBS, nature-based solutions, and the concept of building ecological civilization in China is highly compatible with each other. They respect nature, go in line with nature, protect nature, and they can realize the potential of nature, and ultimately people can live in harmony with nature. In recent years, China has carried out good practices in NBS, such as defining and firmly safeguarding the ecological red line. The so-called ecological red line is based on scientific assessment of regional ecosystems. For areas that are extremely important to ecosystems and areas where ecosystems are sensitive and vulnerable, we develop policies to regulate the scope of their protection. At present, area defined as ecological red line have exceeded 25% of the land area in China, and the marine ecological red line has stepped 30% of the provincial administered sea areas as prohibited development zones. More than 90% of the terrestrial natural ecosystem types and 89% of the national key protected wildlife species are protected. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, at present, protection of biodiversity globally still faces serious challenges. Issues such as climate change, species loss, and habitat destruction have not been contained. Reversing that deteriorating trend of biodiversity is one of the primary goals of mankind for today and the next 10 years. As a host country and presidency country, we look forward to the positive outcomes of COP15. China will work with all parties to develop an ambitious and pragmatic post-2020 framework and build a fair, reasonable, and win-win global biodiversity governance system. To this end, we will work tirelessly day and night to make every effort so that we can ensure COP15 is a complete success, a conference of the parties of landmark significance. We also hope that this global forum today will be able to contribute positively to COP15 so that we can bring together all our efforts to contribute our wisdom and strength to biodiversity protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General. Very inspirational. Now, moving on, we are going to hear from Minister Siti Nurbaya from Indonesia.
Thank you, Professor. Excellencies, let me convey my appreciation for the opportunity to share views on Indonesian forest management, reform, and governance. Since 2001, Indonesia has developed a national initiative, the SVLK, Timber Legality Assurance System, in order to support the eradication of illegal logging, to promote legal timber trade, and to practice good forest governance. We appreciate the support from the UK since 2008 in this regard. SVLK is a system ensuring timber legality and forest sustainability to assure international market that products made timber of Indonesian origin come from legal and sustainable sources. The long participatory process involving wide multi-stakeholders made EU recognize and accepted SVLK as an instrument of timber legality verification of Indonesian timber products for export to the EU within the framework of VPA Flag T, which is signed on September 2013. And the first licenses for timber product export to the EU countries is in November 2016. And we continue improve the implementation of SVLK in Indonesia. Let us now see the benefit of SVLK. Data shows that export performance of Indonesia forestry industry product has increased very significant. The value of export of certified legal wood product increased from 6 billion in 2013 to almost 12 billion US dollar by the end of 2019. SVLK has successfully supported effort to combat illegal logging. In collaborative with the effort on law enforcement and functioning forest management unit at site level, SVLK has decreased the deforestation rate from then 2 million hectares a year at the beginning 2000 to gradually to 1.2 million and 0.68 million hectares a year until 2014 and 0.34 million hectares in 2019. SVLK has made significant reduction in illegal logging. In order to improve the implementation of SVLK by business actors, the ministry since 2015 has implemented several policies and efforts, including simplifying timber regulation and standard for smallholder forest concession and industries for obtaining certificate, as well as providing assistance by state budget when necessary, issuing regulation to prioritize small and medium enterprise that are SVLK certified in the procurement of environmental friendly goods and services. So what we can learn from the development and implementation of SVLK, there are some, including the implementation of SVLK requires a long-term commitment from all sectors and consistency. From time to time, improving rules and regulation based on cross-sectoral dynamism help to restore market confidence in Indonesian wood products originating from legal and sustainable sources and improve governance in the forestry sector. Support the eradication of illegal logging and illicit trading. The credibility and acceptance of the SVLK system in the international market is embedded with the involvement of parties in implementing the system, the self-independent party that is accredited in the verification and certification, and monitoring activities done by a consortium of independent observers. In relation to the role of forest in climate agenda, the Indonesian government has committed and implemented agendas on reducing climate change impact and ensuring the average global temperatures will not increase beyond 2 degrees Celsius. This commitment is expressed in the Indonesia NDC. Unconditional target of the forestry sector is to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 17.2%, about 500 million tons CO2 equivalent. Mitigation actions in the forestry sector reach about 300 million tons, about 260 million tons CO2 reduction surplus against business as usual. We reduce deforestation rate by permanently refraining from issuing new license for logging and peatland utilization since 2019. This covers about 66 million hectares. We are also suspending the issuance of new license for oil palm plantation development for 3 years since 2018. We have evaluated the existing oil palm plantation to designated high conservation value areas and to rearrange fragmented habitats due to the licenses previously issued. The implementation of social forestry program that targeted to provide 12.7 million hectares of legal access to state forests for local community. To ensure the sustainability of mega biodiversity, we actively put into practice the three pillars of conservation: protection of life support system, preservation of genetic resources and its ecosystem, and sustainable utilization of natural resources. We did inventory of high conservation value forests from the concession and cultivation areas. We are also now developing corridors connecting the fragmented habitats to manage meta-population for species survival. We would like to see in both the COPs of CBD and UNFCCC decisions that encompass knowledge sharing and financial mechanism that value both the biodiversity and carbon benefit. Landscape conservation for carbon emission control, while enhancing species conservation for its survival, would reflect both aspects of biodiversity and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Perfect timekeeping again. And now moving on to Pierre Tati from Congo, if you would like to please give the minister's speech.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je disais au nom de Madame la ministre Rosalie Matondo, qui est ministre de l'économie forestière de la République du Congo. Donc, je prends la parole en son nom pour vous délivrer le message qu'il avait prévu donc lire à cette occasion.
Muchísimas gracias.
So, as it relates to land use and forestry, the National Forest Policy for 2015-2020 has an overall objective which enables us to implement initiatives to meet the target met by the government. And we can do this through a more diversified wood processing. In terms of forest resources management, the vision of our country is to make Congo one of the world's leaders for certified tropical wood, carried by an industry that fully values the resource and exploited from a forest under sustainable management, fully playing its role of carbon sink and a sanctuary of biodiversity serving humanity. With the 2025 deadline approaching and taking into account national and international developments, the vision for forests and land use would be as follows. By 2060, the Congo's forests, natural and planted, are fully managed, certified and managed sustainably with a view to fighting climate change. These forests support an integrated local industry of wood and non-wood products and a sustainable tourism industry, higher degrees of wood processing, as well as national and international trade in legal and traceable products. They also contribute more to improving the living conditions of rural populations and to increasing forest revenue from innovative tax and carbon transactions. And all this is planned in a land context that defines allocations precisely and definitively and allocates land for the development of associated forests and ecosystems. Now, priorities for governance reform. The priorities listed are those which led to the revision of the Forest Code in force since 2000. So the new Forest Code, promulgated this year, incorporates the following reforms. First of all, we have the strengthening of the interests of local communities and indigenous populations, in particular by applying the participatory approach through free and prior informed consent. It's also done by strengthening user rights by setting up community development series and by renewing and making more systematic local development funds. The second priority reform is the strengthening of sustainable management, continuing the development and certification of forest concessions while further integrating processing chains and protected areas. Improvements, or the third reform, is the improvement of the contribution of the forest sector to gross domestic product by creating innovative taxes and selling carbon credits. The fourth priority, strengthening governance and transparency in the management of forest resources by creating, within the Forestry Administration, a specific structure responsible for monitoring the national computerized system for verifying legality and forest traceability, as well as setting up an independent observatory managed by a civil society platform and the installation of a national certification group, which is called PAFC Congo. The fifth priority, the establishment of the complete processing of logs on the nationally, taking into account the special economic zones, which are tax-exempt industry zones, with a view to increasing the value of the wood resource in terms of taxes, duties, employment, etc. The sixth priority, the establishment of the principle of production sharing and a central purchasing office for logs in order to guarantee a source of supply of logs for non-concessional manufacturers and to promote secondary species. As part of these reforms, a particular attention will be paid to the promotion of more effective participatory forestry in the context of the 2030 Agenda, whose roadmap was adopted in Brazzaville. This should contribute to the implementation of certain operational objectives of the COMECAF Convergence Plan for the sustainable management of the forest ecosystems of Central Africa, among which there is the promote community and decentralized management of forest resources, and also the strengthening of the active participation of vulnerable populations in the management of forest resources. So as it relates to the role of global partnerships, the Republic of Congo welcomes the good cooperation with international partners. This cooperation is promising and expects a multifaceted support intended for the technical support of institutions and the strengthening of operational, intellectual, cognitive, and logistical capacities. We also hope for support for reforms. We hope for the transfer of technologies and tools adapted to the management of natural resources. And then also we hope for financing dedicated to payments for environmental services. So some examples of very appreciated initiatives are as follows: the project to reduce CO2 emissions from the forests of the departments of the Republic of Congo, and that was part of the Pre-Forest Congo project. And the objective was to reduce greenhouse gases emissions from the forest caused by slash and burn agriculture and wood energy, and to diversify productive systems to generate economic and social benefits for local populations and to increase their resilience to climate change. This will result in improving land and forest management to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to building adaptive capacity and reducing exposure to climate risks. The second example is the deployment of computerized systems that would enable us to fund projects. It would enable us to develop agroecology and agroforestry in savanna and forest areas. It would enable us to apply sustainable management and monitoring of the permanent forest domain and non-permanent forest domain. We could develop and implement strategies to reduce unsustainable fuel wood removals. It would help us to improve the system for carrying out and monitoring environmental and social impact studies and strategic social environmental assessments. It would also enable us to capacity build on non-governmental actors for the implementation and follow-up of the commitments of the letter of intent. The third example is the deployment of the computerized system, as I was saying, for verifying legality and traceability, allowing at the same time the documentation of all of the data of the forest sector. And so the expected outcomes of the 2021 COP on climate, by mobilizing bilateral and multilateral partnerships, it can be expected from the COP 2021 agreements on SFM, aimed at promoting multi-purpose forest plantations with a view to preserving natural forests in the long term. Second expectation, partnerships for substantial and sustained financial support with a view to supporting the ongoing development and certification program, financing afforestation and reforestation operations, and the investment plan of the National Red Plus strategy. And finally, taking more account of forests in enhancing the ambitions of countries who wish to fight against the effects of climate change in the framework of a national determined contributions programme, as well as the implementation of the Paris Agreement and nature-based solutions. So that is the message from the Minister to the participants of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for stepping in at the last moment. And now our final high-level panelist is Professor Xiong, Director General from MOFCOM. Over to you, sir. You're unmuted. You're still muted.
您还是静音状态。
OK，
您还是
好，大家好，我概要讲3个观点。
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be very brief about 3 points. The first point is in the era of globalization, forest governance is a systematic and complicated project system. Especially when we look at the supply chain and value chain connection in a globalized world, global forest governance faced with uphill tasks, and it will last a long time. It has a long way to go. We have noticed that many developing countries feel it's important to grow their economy, and during that development, they have to develop and explore forest products. Minister Zhang is offline. This is from the interpreter.
Interpreter, please, could you ask him to switch off his video and go to audio only?
Yes, I have told him.
Thank you.
Minister,
try speaking now. I think given the connection issues, we may need to move on to the next portion and come back to the professor.
Yep, I would suggest let's move on to the questions and see whether or not he can sort out his connectivity. Can somebody translate that to him behind the scenes? Thank you. Right, so sorry about this mix-up. It's kind of inevitable in this day and age that sometimes the technology will go wrong. So let's just move on to the question and answer session. And I have my first question is for Lord Goldsmith and DG Sway as COP leads for the CBD and the FCC COPs. How are the UK and China planning to build synergy on the nature theme between the two COPs? And how will these political processes support action on the ground that encourages sustainable forest uses and that benefit the global poor? So, who would like to go first? I can see Lord Goldsmith's face. So.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the question. It's a critically important question. There's no doubt that in order to tackle climate change, you need to invest in restoring and protecting nature on a massive scale. There's no path to net zero, for instance, without a huge emphasis on nature. You can't do one without the other. And the second point to make is that good solutions, sound solutions to climate change will contribute to the objectives of the CBD COP that our friends in China are convening and hosting. So if we get it right at the climate COP, that will have a big impact in terms of CBD. And if nations come together and get it right at CBD, that will have a big impact in terms of climate change. We can't see these two things as separate issues. And we have a massively important opportunity now to work together, China and the United Kingdom. And it's a real pleasure to meet two colleagues from China today with responsibilities respectively for the CBD CBD, but also the issue of supply chains, which is critically important, again, for both the CBD and the climate COP. I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and President Xi agreed a couple of months ago in March that the UK and China would work closely together to tackle both these issues in a connected manner, biodiversity loss and climate change. Last month, the COP president, Alok Sharma, who's also the Secretary of State for BEIS, spoke to Minister Huang Wenqi, and they agreed to establish a dialogue between the senior officials to discuss climate change and biodiversity in a comprehensive, combined manner. And our embassy in Beijing has been in touch with DG Qui's team to get this started as soon as possible. And I would really appreciate those discussions being given maximum priority. If I could, for 30 seconds, the specific areas where I think we can work together. I mentioned supply chains, and I mentioned that actually in the speech that I gave, but between the United Kingdom and China, I think we can build a really big collaboration and cooperation between producer and consumer countries. You know, we know that commodities are hugely important for livelihoods in the countries where they're produced. We also know that we need to do something about our footprint. The United Kingdom's footprint, just with commodities alone, is extended about 90% beyond the size of the United Kingdom. That's the 7 top commodities. So I'm looking forward to working with, we are looking forward to working with China on that issue. We want to look at some of the incentives that we had, that I outlined in my speech around land use subsidies. And it's obviously crucial that the targets that are agreed and set at the CBD both contribute to tackling climate change, but also enable us to get beyond the nice words that we've had historically towards meaningful action. And I think between these two conventions, next year ought to be the super year for nature. It ought to be the moment where people out there can see that the world's governments are finally taking these issues as seriously as they ought to. But we have a huge responsibility on our shoulders in the United Kingdom, just as China does as well. And we will need to work together, and I look forward to that.
Thank you very much. As somebody who has worked on biodiversity conservation for the last 30 years, I'm really heartened to hear that positive message. Director General Sway, are you with us? Your camera is off. Did you hear the question?
那个，您再重复一下您的问题。
Can you repeat your question, please?
The question is, how can you, working with the CBD COP and UK working with the UNFCCC COP, how can you build synergy between the two around the nature theme, and how will these political processes support action on the ground that encourages sustainable forest management?
好的，这是一个非常好的问题。
Thank you. This is a great question. As Lord Goldsmith has deliberated earlier this year, President Xi Jinping of China, together with the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, reached an agreement on this issue. At a working level, we will work very closely to prepare for COP15 and COP26 to work jointly on climate change and also biodiversity issues. I'm sure that there are many areas of potential collaboration between COP15 and COP26. As I mentioned in my speech, nature-based solutions would be a brilliant way to start off our collaboration, would be a brilliant bridge of our collaboration. Of course, biodiversity loss has a huge impact on climate change. Through the protection of biodiversity, the increase of carbon sequestration, the increase of carbon sinks, it will help us to mitigate the impact of climate change. So I'm sure that those areas have great opportunities to collaborate together, and they are of great significance. Through that collaboration, we can replicate, we can learn from mature collaborative models of climate change, and to use that on biodiversity, in particular, in terms of funding for certain projects. We will be able to bring everybody together and reach consensus among governments of countries. I would also want to say that close collaboration, close exchange of ideas between the working groups of two COPs will have important significance on the successful opening of 2 COPs. So on that note, I would very much like to work very closely with our British colleagues, with colleagues from all countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that response. My next question is for Pierre Tati and Minister Siti Nurbaya. And the question is, given our global ambitions, how do you think the economic crisis resulted from the current COVID-19 pandemic will impact upon your efforts to promote sustainable trade and sustainable forest use? What measures can we take to ensure that the unfolding economic downturn will not negatively impact on forest ecosystems?
Thank you, Professor. In responding to the pandemic COVID-19, we keep our forestry sector as stable as possible by keeping forestry business working, by providing facilities to businesses to continue their activities. Among such measures are relaxing some procedures, delaying loan repayment, extending grace period, optimizing state budget, and prioritizing labor-intensive activities through social forestry program and for activities on reforestation. We also provide e-learning about how to manage forests sustainably, especially for smallholders to comply with COVID-19 protocol. With social forestry program, the smallholders of a concession, we apply e-learning to our forest farmers. We provide incentive which would be given to farmer group if they implement the e-learning outcome in their business work plan by selecting clusters of forest and food commodities that can be used to provide production input. We also ensure the wildlife in ex situ conservation areas can survive by providing sufficient feed. We also support their non-timber products for the smallholders on marketing and improving market system with online system. We continue protect forest from encroachment and law enforcement, and to some extent applying restorative justice. We control the national park on their eco-tourism activities for forest healing. By considering the COVID condition, we continue every day in the morning and in the evening, how is the situation in that site, and we apply a COVID protocol. So that kind of thing, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pierre, have you anything to add from your perspective?
Merci. Pour ce qui concerne le Congo, bien évidemment.
Thank you very much. As it relates to Congo, we are all hit by the pandemic, and first of all, measures have been taken by the government, so emergency measures to try to stem the crisis. As it relates to the forest sector, it's a forest sector it's a sector that is a priority sector and that will continue to work throughout the pandemic. But systems and initiatives have been put in place to enable teams to continue to work, particularly as part of fighting poaching, for example, and illegal logging, because these are things that continue to take over. At the same time, the government has also implemented facilities to try to take some pressure off some companies in terms of taxes. And so we are continuing to work, but with a streamlined tax model. So efforts have been made to support companies so that activities aren't all struck too much by the crisis. And obviously, we're trying to ensure that we are continuing sustainable forest management, traceability, etc. So that's what I would answer to your question. And I would also second what was said by the Minister.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Zhang.
Okay.
Are you there? Hooray! Do you want to start again with your speech, because you were cut off very early on in that?
对，请您启用我的摄像头，请主持人启用我的摄像头。Can you hear me?
Can you turn on my camera, please? Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you. Let me see if I can turn on your camera.
Okay.
I'm not sure. That's under my control.
I will ask Robin to do so. Please continue,
Thank you.
Professor, and we'll switch it on. Oh, brilliant.
It's on. Good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll carry on from where I left. My first point was about global forest governance as an important role which needs host country to cooperate with other countries. In this process, host countries' laws, policy systems, and best practices are very important. Therefore, from this point of view, in recent years, as the Forest Product International Trade Center, as someone from this center, we have worked with forest administrations closely and did a lot of work on log verification and certification, and we have carried a lot of work in certification of logging, and this is an important direction in the future for us. My next point is for us to achieve the targets of climate change and to protect biodiversity. This requires countries from around the world to understand each other and to respect each other's developmental objectives. In this regard, I highly appreciate many countries in Europe, including the UK's practice. They have valued the Paris Agreement and implementing the CBD implementation, and especially with the conference held in China, we'll see significant progress. And China has done a lot in this regard. Talking about myself, I was trained in Beijing University on ecology, and my supervisor was Professor Chen Changyu. He was the first scholar in China working with the Ministry of Ecology to implement the practices of environmental protection, and he played a vital role in making China joining the CBD negotiations. Unfortunately, he passed away this spring, but as his former student, I personally feel very privileged to continue his work in this field and to build up his heritage. So this is the one field I'd like to touch on. What I'd like to stress here is when we talk about protection of biodiversity and the sustainable forestry, actually, the importing country and the consumer countries are both important. Especially China has become more and more important importer of forest products and timber products. That's why we have worked with a lot of production countries and exporting countries on green forestry products, about the standards, certification, best practice manufacturing of such products. We are doing what we can to offer technological support and assistance. Actually, in this field, we have academy which admit many students from African countries, including government officials and technical experts. We provide training for them in this academy. And myself, I have been closely involved in sustainable forestry management. So in the future, we'll provide continuous support like this to African countries. And of course, we are delighted to be able to work with the UK to promote actions in this regard. The final point I'd like to mention is when we are working towards the road of sustainable forest governance, we need a sustainable dialogue channels and mechanisms. In this area, China is working on ecological civilization development, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. I have worked with China's environmental protection administrations, and we have developed the framework of Green One Belt and One Road. And one element of that element is around climate change. How can countries carry out far-reaching and wide international cooperations, especially how can we help developing countries and less capable countries to have enough funding and technologies and talents to do that. In this area, I worked with the CAS, a team from CAS to carry out studies. I have personally been an LDG lead about country progress. I was impressed with the effort made by China. Actually, China made much more effort in this regard than asked. So when we are working towards the objective of SDG, it's my hope that China can work with many developing countries further so that we can fulfill our 2030 objectives in time, including sustainable governance of forest and how we can better use land. We need to continue our study in this regard and need to perfect our policies and to share best practices. So this is what I'd like to share. Thank you for your attention.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Great presentation under difficult circumstances. We are now in the last 25 minutes or so moving into general discussion, question and answers from the floor. We are getting lots and lots and lots of questions, and I'm trying in my mind to kind of group some of them together. So let me just start off, and I think this is the sort of question that is relevant to every single country represented, whether from an exporting timber perspective or an importing timber perspective. And the question is, what is the best way of ensuring sustainable forest management? Is it through a commodity based approach, through trade agreements? Is it through ensuring that the background trade legality under WTO is really strong? Is it through absolutely bilateral country-to-country conversations? How do we manage the whole trade relationships to drive sustainability in the forest sector? Would anybody like to tackle that from a perspective? I know in the UK we have had a working group, the Global Resources Initiative, that has been looking at how to think through sustainable trade from a forest risks perspective. So perhaps Lord Goldsmith, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the short answer, I should say, is that it's a little bit of everything that you just suggested. And none of this stuff is going to work in isolation. And I think there's a lot of scope for bilateral agreements. We've been working very closely with a number of areas, not least Indonesia. We have a really good relationship there. We're looking for other opportunities as well, having doubled our international climate finance. And having committed to putting a big emphasis on nature-based solutions, there'll be lots of scope there for bilateral arrangements of the sort that we are hopefully developing in relation to Indonesia. But there's also the non-public money stuff, the supply chain. So we are facing a lot of pressure in this country from consumers, which is translating into reactions by supermarkets around this issue of deforestation in the supply chains. The previous Secretary of State for Department for Environment commissioned the Global Resource Institute to come up with a review, and its headline recommendation, one among many, is that it provides ideas for various mechanisms for removing deforestation from our supply chains. That at the surface, it's absolutely the right thing to do. The government is looking with great interest and will be responding formally soon. But we don't believe it's possible to deliver a mechanism of that sort without collaboration. we recognize that commodities are hugely important for the countries that produce them, but we also are committed to reducing our ecological footprint. So we are going to tackle deforestation in our supply chains, but we will do so through partnerships, and we'll do so through engagement with the key producer countries. My view is that it's a win-win situation. For countries that can move further towards genuine sustainable production of commodities and removing deforestation from their own production systems, those countries will have better market access to countries where consumers put an increasing value on ecological footprint. So for me, if this is handled well and handled properly, my view is that this is a really good thing for the producer countries, and it's a really good thing for the consumer countries. And fundamentally, we don't really have a choice. Because if trends continue, we will see the continued destruction of extraordinarily important habitat around the world, with repercussions for biodiversity, for things like water and food production, rainfall, but also climate change, which is the greatest threat we face. So one way or another, we have to learn to live within our means, and that means land use has to change. We have to change the way we manage land. I'll make one final point, if I could, really quick, and just to repeat this: there needs to be a greater focus on the incentives. We have, there's a lot of movement around the world around the idea of tackling fossil fuel subsidies, and that's a great thing. But there's very little discussion about the land use subsidies. But they're huge, $700 billion a year. The top 50 food producing countries. If you even shifted a fraction of that towards sustainable land use, that would have a massive impact. So I really hope more and more countries will join us in the run up to the CBD and COP, and that we could form a partnership of the willing, countries that are really ambitious and wanting to get to grips with what is a very complex issue, but critically important.
Thank you very much, Lord Goldsmith. Professor Zhang, do you have anything to add on how to leverage the rules of international trade for good forest management?
Yes, indeed. I'll just add 2 points. First point is under WTO framework. Actually, WTO has always been exploring how we can promote green trade and sustainable trade. As you all know, WTO has a International Sustainable Trade Center, and I spoke several times at that center. In this regard, under MOFCOM, China had Directorate of International Trade, and this directorate started research over a decade ago how we can promote the green trade and sustainable trade. Talking about this issue, indeed, this is a complicated and challenging piece of work. But in recent years, if you look at the platform like APEC, we have formed a checklist of environmental products. And WTO has also been looking into how such a list of environmental products can be expanded so that more member countries can onboard that. So in this process of reform, we need to continue to promote such work so that under the rule system of the WTO system, sustainable trade can be achieved and promoted. My second point is about green standards and certification of sustainable foreign products. This is also a very complex system. This including compulsory standard systems of host countries, but also some widely recognized systems or voluntary systems, or we call VES. As you can see, systems like FSC has been very well known across the world, and China has made a significant progress as well in this regard. So under such headlines, I think between the state and the market, there are a lot of room to be explored. And so if we can do more about green forest products certification, so that such products can enjoy greater market share, we're one step closer to these objectives. Thank you to the chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. From the point of view of forest product exporters, Indonesia and Congo, is there anything you would like to add about how best to stimulate, incentivize green trade in forest products?
Thank you, Professor Benton. If we learned deeply on as FELCA, that is actually regarding the legality. So this legality assurance is very important. In Indonesia, this is more complex and come up to the governance. Forest governance is, I think, the ultimate that we recognize for that. So also in tackling, let's say, in analyzing the palm oil problems in Indonesia, as FELCA, the timber legality is also our reference. So the main point is the legality assurance, the governance, which is reflecting, let's say, for the government, licensing is an instrument for the controlling. And the activities reflecting also what is the incentive to be given, let's say carbon pricing, etc., etc. So this kind of thing. The other thing on this governance aspect, including our own relation to the legality assurance is participatory. So in forest, community participation is very important because this is waking up the community, let's say, participation and community awareness. This kind of thing, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Congo, Pierre.
Je pense que mes prédécesseurs ont été assez éloquents sur la question pour dire que ça ne peut pas être une solution, c'est plutôt une somme de petites solutions techniques, politiques, etc., de gouvernance qui pourront aider effectivement à résoudre cette question de gestion durable. Mais si je peux me permettre juste sur un ou deux détails, c'est de dire qu'il va falloir quand même effectivement regarder du côté du commerce international du bois, parce que ce que nous remarquons pour le cas de nos pays, c'est que c'est un commerce qui se focalise sur un nombre d'essences assez réduit, donc une dizaine d'essences, de sorte que la multitude, disons la trentaine, sinon la soixantaine d'essences qu'on peut couper.
So we have about 100 species that can be logged, but the rest are left untouched. So we are going very fast. We're consuming lots of spaces, which means that the management is very difficult. Second point. So we're talking about the first aspect, but the number of exploited and logged species is increasing. So the buyers should change their consuming habits and could maybe focus on other species. And that's another important point. We need to focus on wood and logs transformation and processing as well. Of course, we have a very low income, 30%, 40%, so we have a lot of waste. However, if we could go further and recuperate some of this matter, we can increase our revenues, and this would help managing our other species in a better and more sustainable way.
Thank you very much, sir. I now have a question from Yimin Yi for Professor Zhang. I guess this is particularly about imported timber to China. According to some analyses, illegal logging and deforestation are very important, supplying 80% of your tropical timber imports to China. How will the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China play a role in preventing illegal timber imports? Professor Zhang, did you hear that?
Ah, 可以。其实关于非法采伐的这个问题。
In terms of the issue of illegal logging, the State Forestry Administration has done a lot of work to alleviate this issue because many years ago, China recognized the importance of solving this issue. Together with international communities, we've carried out a wide range of conversations, dialogues, and cooperation mechanisms to explore effective way of solving those issues. as I mentioned earlier on, I've also worked at the International Forest Cooperation Center so I acted as a witness of China's efforts in this regard. The British colleague also talked about that China has achieved a lot in terms of illegal logging, and the measures we've been taking are much more effective. What I can share with you is that recently China has just revised the forest law of China. And in that new edition, it looked into illegal logging and also penalties for illegal logging. So we have a legal foundation, a legal base to do that. That is a remarkable progress for China. Of course, that looking ahead, there are large room for improvement, and we need to carry out further work. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. A question now for Minister Nurbaya from Indonesia. Perhaps most straightforwardly directed at your government. How can governments contribute to the eradication of poverty and reduction of inequalities whilst promoting forests and sustainable supply chains? Minister Nurbaya, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. In Indonesia, we have about 25,000 villages. Out of 70,000 villages are in the forest or surrounding the forest. So they are all average in the poor areas. So President Joko Widodo has a policy that we have to support these villages while keep the function of the forest as its function on environment. That's why we support, we call it social forestry. We have in Indonesia 120 to 125 million hectares of forest, and about 40 million of forest be in the use and for having some production. And about 12.7 to 13 million hectares are now we provide to be given the legal access for the villagers within and surrounding the forest area. Of course, we support not only the legal access, but also providing the management and also the techniques and facilities for the practices. So poverty alleviation can be supported for these communities within and surrounding the forest. We have already now given the access for about 4.2 million hectares, the social forestry, for more than 800,000 families, households. So it helps because in the former time, the concession is mainly for corporate. But now this is the time that the concession is also for the smallholders. This kind of thing, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. Pierre, do you want to add anything to that question from your perspective in the Congo?
Je voudrais m'excuser parce que j'ai eu.
I would like to apologize. I had a connection problem, which means that I did not hear the question. Could you ask the question again?
Yes, of course, of course. Well, I'll actually ask a related question in that regard then. Developing economies are facing increasing conflicts and disputes over land and access to natural resources. How can countries like your own contribute to better recognition of indigenous land rights and community-based sustainable tenure?
Si, d'abord, il faut dire que au Congo,
First of all, in the Congo, we have a law which guarantees some rights to the indigenous peoples. It has been adopted. So within this law, we say that some spaces are reserved, of course, forest spaces or areas. So they are protected, and these populations can use them for their well-being. However, as I was telling you earlier in the minister's speech, in our reforms, we went a bit further to guarantee the right of use, specifically regarding, well, how shall I put it? We've strengthened some community development initiatives. The interpreter cannot hear the speaker.
I think he has frozen. Thank you very much, Pierre. We will wait for you to come back online. We are running out of time, and to the audience, I am afraid there is no chance of us getting through all of the questions. But I do want to ask a general question, which is not specific to any individual country, and that is, how do we collectively intend to deal with countries, perhaps like Brazil, that are currently not prioritizing conservation of forests in their agendas? And what are the solutions to encourage a broader sustainable model for forests in such countries? Who would like to have a go at that one? That's quite a tricky one. Zach, you're raising your eyebrows.
Well, it's a crucial question, as in fact are all the questions that have been put to us today. I would simply say that countries that are reluctant at the moment, who are not engaging in the way that we on this call believe they should, are nevertheless going to have to respond to pressures that go way beyond the NGO community. So, for example, we heard just a few days ago the biggest buyer for China of soya make some very, very bold comments in relation to cleaning up the supply chain, not contributing to deforestation. Now, that's not politics, that's the market. It's making a big signal which producers of soya, like Brazil, have no choice but to respond to. They either respond or they lose markets. In the United Kingdom, obviously, my country, in my country, we have supermarkets which are taking quite radical positions in relation to things like palm oil. My view is that if we can establish a partnership now, we can avoid a misreaction or the wrong reaction by the supermarkets. Palm oil is an extraordinary commodity, extraordinarily efficient. We don't want to see palm oil replaced by something that's going to take up vastly more land. But we do want to ensure that the palm oil that we're buying is sustainably sourced. And most of the palm oil, in fact, that we import into this country is already sustainably produced, around 70%. But the reality is that countries aren't going to be responding to these pressures out of goodwill necessarily. They'll be responding to these pressures because that's what the market determines. If buyers want a certain quality, then the seller has to respond to that. So I do think that the market pressure is building up, partly as a consequence of consumer pressure, and the governments that are going to get it right are the governments that pay attention to those pressures.
So can I ask a follow-up to that, just briefly? So how will the market differentiate between commodities that are produced in a sustainable way and in a non-sustainable way, given that a lot of the time there isn't that transparency at point of sale, for example?
Yeah, and that's a question that we're grappling with here in the UK. I mean, there are lots of international standards, some of them very strong, some of them less so. The reality is that my colleagues on the phone who are listening in might a better place to answer this than I am, but my understanding is that most of the producer countries have the right laws in place, that if there's a problem, that problem often relates to laws not being implemented, or it relates to illegal activity. So the question then is not about inventing lots of new laws or standards. The question is about implementing existing laws. And that's, again, an area where collaboration can help. So the UK, with our increased ICF, would like to be able to help countries get to grips with illegality, for example, in countries which are struggling to deal with illegality. That's an area perhaps where we can add value. and that depends very much on whether producer countries want us to help. But it seems to me that the criminality aspect, the illegality aspect, is a really obvious starting point.
Thank you very much, sir. Minister Nabaya, do you want to add anything on to that question? How do we, as an international community, help other countries prioritize forest management better?
Yeah, in Indonesia, in our case, actually it is written in the constitution, Professor. It is saying in the Article 28, it's saying that it is the right of the citizens to get a good environment. And also it is in the Article of 33 saying that natural resources should be managed sustainably. So as Minister Smith saying about this consumer pressure, I agree with that. There is a consumer pressure saying about this and that, but of course we have to check what is the real situation in that country. Let's say maybe it's good to engage now more intensive to the parliament community. We have international parliament union. Maybe within the networking of parliamentary union, we can give pressure to the government, to the executive, to encourage about this legal supply chains, sustainability, and those kind of things. In Indonesia, we have a very strong constitution and also strong act or law about these matters. So that helps.
Thank you very much. And Professor Zhang, I think last word to you. How do you encourage the international community to manage forests better, and particularly perhaps with the Belt and Road Initiative, where you're investing infrastructure and helping countries develop? How do you ensure that they develop in a sustainable way as well?
Well,
I think that the Belt and Road Initiative proposed by the Chinese government can be comprehended as a practical platform for cooperation internationally. We hope that through the interconnectedness of infrastructure, through the interconnectedness on a people-to-people level, and also through the development of digital economy, we will be able to provide valuable opportunities for those developing countries to develop. If those people in developing countries have brighter future, have more opportunities to find jobs, to find employment, then they would not be solely dependent upon harvesting natural resources or utilizing natural resources. Brazil has been a middle-income country for many years, but they still heavily rely upon commodities and also the natural environment and natural resources. So if we were able to find new ways of encouraging employment, encouraging jobs, then perhaps we will be able to provide a better livelihood, a better income for those local people, then the pressure on natural resources would be alleviated. So I think that the COP15 meeting next year, and also the climate change COP meeting next year under the Belt and Road Initiative, and through our common effort, we will be able to promote countries to better manage forest resources. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, everybody. I am very sad to say that we are coming out of time now, so just a few thank yous at the end. Obviously, thank you incredibly to our very rich discussion to the panelists. Thank you to the 150 or so people who have tuned in to listen. Thank you to the 30-odd people who wrote questions, and I'm very sorry we didn't have a chance to ask them all off the panel. Thank you very much to the team of interpreters behind the scenes, the AV people, and coping with, I know what it's like, coping with issues when people drop off. Very much thank you to Mr. Pierre Tati for stepping in for his minister at the last moment. And thank you, everybody, for taking part. I can't say safe journeys because you're all back in your home countries, but thank you very much. And I hope you tune in for other sessions during this week of the Forest Forum. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.
Mm.